Hey everyone, welcome back to Inside Indiana Overtime. Obviously a little bit different this week. Zach is off at a wedding and for this game and actually might be headed to the Star sometime in the next couple weeks, so he might not really be back for an Inside Indiana Overtime ever again as a member of Inside Indiana, as we talked a little bit about last week. And it's also a little bit different because this was Indiana's first road game. We're not at Memorial Stadium, we're not at Spartan Stadium, obviously. I'm here in my apartment in Bloomington, not in East Lansing. But still watched the game, still was on the thread talking with everyone, writing a little bit, and it was about IU Michigan State. Obviously, Indiana went up there wanting to move to 2-0 in the Big Ten, wanting to win 2 games in a row for the first time this year, and they couldn't. Fell 42-28 to Michigan State. It was fairly similar to the Penn State game where it was close for 2.5, 3 quarters. It was kind of a one-score game until Michigan State scored, I think with 3.5 minutes left or something like that, in the third quarter, and made it a 14-point game. And from then on, Indiana just kind of ran out of bullets, kind of ran out of answers, and just couldn't keep up with Michigan State. And Indiana obviously took that lead early in the game. Just a minute in, Tevin Coleman ran for 64 yards, for a 64-yard score, which was actually more than Michigan State was allowing per game this year, which kind of got people fired up on Twitter, on the thread, got Indiana fans fired up, that is. But after that, Michigan State really clamped down, really showed that play was more of an anomaly than something that we could expect for the entire game. Indiana, even after that 64-yard run, didn't get to 100 yards in the game, ended up with 92. Tevin Coleman ended up with 79. He still just had that score, which actually extended his streak. He has scored in every game this year, which is quite a feat. I mean, say what you will about the rushing performance today and a couple other games, but the fact that he has scored in every game this season is pretty impressive, especially for a sophomore. And on the other side of the ball, there were a lot of issues for Indiana's defense in terms of tackling. I know a lot of the players after the game were talking about that a lot of the issues they've really been harping on, really been working on, like communicating, being lined up correctly, being what they call gap sound, where you kind of stick to your assignment and figure out how to plug every gap. They were in the right place a lot of the time today. They were in the right place at the right time. Communication was good, but at times it looked like they were playing two-hand touch, where they had a guy squared up and just couldn't finish the job. It was kind of reminiscent of a couple years ago when Indiana was having some really major tackling issues, and then during the end of the season last year, where they're just kind of bouncing off guys. But there were a couple times, where they were lined up right, they had them, and I remember there was a third down where Michigan State running back Jeremy Langford, who had an enormous game, he scored 4 touchdowns, 3 on the ground, he had 109 yards rushing, where I think it was a 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, something like that, where he runs a little bit to the left, and Bobby Richardson kind of has his arms around his legs and just can't bring him down, can't slow him enough for other Indiana players to help him tackle him. He escapes and runs for a touchdown. It was like that for a lot of the day today in East Lansing for Indiana against that Michigan State offense, which hasn't, through its first 3 or 4 games, it just looked very anemic, very unpolished, inexperienced. But last week against Iowa and then this week against Indiana, they've shown the ability to kind of put up points a little bit more, be a little bit more consistent on offense, especially from the quarterback position, where sophomore Connor Cook played really well today. There was someone on Twitter or on the chat today who said that Indiana was making Connor Cook look like Peyton Manning, and maybe not to that extent, but he still completed 22 of his 31 passes, 235 yards, 2 touchdowns, and he made it look fairly easy. I know Greg Keevan was saying after the game that Michigan State was really hurting Indiana a lot of the time with kind of, he was saying they were nickel and dimed a lot, just a lot of kind of shorter plays, and then they would burn them over top with a couple long plays or maybe with a couple long runs. But it seems like that Michigan State quarterback situation is much better than it looked 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they were still kind of unsure which guy they wanted to play and which guy deserved the job, basically. And it looks like it's Connor Cook's job to lose at this point. He played really well today. And Indiana's quarterbacks, it was another interesting kind of week for that. Nate Sudfeld started again, but was much less effective than maybe he's been in past games, where Trey Roberson kind of came in. And we've seen we've seen Roberson come in quite a bit this season and run the ball, basically, where he's just more of a runner, more of a manager of the offense than he is a true dual threat quarterback. I mean, he's almost been used more of as a wildcat quarterback this season, with IU really telegraphing its plays with him. But today, they aired it out a little bit with him. They threw it 17 times with Trey Roberson, which is much more than we've seen it this season. He was 11 for 17, 122 yards, 2 touchdowns, and just looked very comfortable back there, even with the rush that Michigan State was putting on. And he looked comfortable in a lot of situations where really Nate Sudfeld didn't. And Sudfeld had, not his best day. He completed 14 passes for 137 yards. So there were a lot of plays that either went nowhere or went, 5-6 yards. They're doing a lot of screen passes that didn't work, a lot of shorter routes because obviously there was pressure in Sudfeld's face. He didn't have that much time to throw. And he just looked a little bit more off today, a little bit more bothered than maybe he's been in past games. I know there are a couple people saw him kind of playing with his knee a couple times and thinking about, is Sudfeld hurt or something like that. But Wilson said after the game, and Sudfeld said that there was just something wrong with his brace, that there was some grass in it or something that he was playing with. So he wasn't injured. It just wasn't his best game. He was dealing with a lot of pressure, in terms of the pass rush, and just never really got it going. I mean, this Indiana team, as we've said over and over, is really rhythm based. I mean, getting a first down on that first set of downs on a drive is huge for them, just because it sets the pace for the offense, and it sets the pace for the quarterback as well, where he can really get into a rhythm, where he can kind of get more of a feel for the game. But we're seeing Indiana kind of figure out where to play those quarterbacks, what situations to put them in, what to ask them to do, kind of. Where you can obviously, based on this game, based on a couple of performances, can put it a little bit more in Roberson's hands to throw the ball, and we saw Nate Sudfeld actually run the ball pretty effectively when he had to. I mean, there weren't any designed runs, there weren't anything like that, but where he escaped pressure and ran for a couple of first downs. So we're seeing that Indiana's kind of trying to put those quarterbacks in, play to their strengths. There were a couple times late in the game where maybe Roberson would have been a little bit more well suited for the situation, being down a couple scores, where Roberson was missing on a couple downfield passes where Sudfeld maybe would have made those throws. And I mean, and that kind of leads to something I wrote my column about, was just with Indiana reacting and with Indiana making mental adjustments. And it just sounds it's such a central part of the game, and something that it seems like Indiana should have maybe figured out by now. But the ability to react not only to losses but to wins. They've gone, as I said, they've gone win-loss, win-loss, win-loss this season. They haven't strung together 2 wins, which is really something that Kevin Wilson has said over the past couple of years is something that his team really, really needs to do, is to not have a good week, but to have a good stretch of games where you win a game, you take a full week to react to that game, move on to the next game, and just kind of stay at an even level. There are a couple players this week who are talking about just kind of staying level, not getting too high, when things are going well, like against Penn State, not getting too low when you're down against Navy or Missouri or something like that, where they wanted to maintain a more level, emotional level, and they just weren't able to do that. This week it seemed that they just, by the end of the game today, they just kind of looked defeated, where they were trying to get to the end of the game. It looked like a little bit at times there, where mentally, I mean, you have to react. You have to bounce back. You have to put negatives in the past. You have to also put positives in the past, where you can't, Kobe Hughes said this a couple times this week, where sure, adjustments during the game are major, but adjustments between games and staying focused for a whole week is a challenge that this team has not yet really been able to face or accomplish. So they'll try to get back at that next week. Obviously, they're going back to Michigan next week, going to Ann Arbor, playing Michigan at 3:30 next Saturday. I will actually be there, so you'll see me in a stadium instead of in my apartment. So it'll seem a little bit more genuine, maybe. But we'll have full coverage leading up to that game, and full coverage obviously from that game. So stick with us here at Inside Indiana. We'll keep you covered for the next week, leading up to Michigan, leading up to a little bit of basketball preview stuff. So yeah, keep with us, and we'll talk to you next week from Ann Arbor. So once again, I'm Alex McCarthy. This has been Inside Indiana Over.